The Vikings, a term collectively used to describe Scandinavian farmers who raided parts of Europe from the 9th to the 11th century. Most people have a vague idea of who the Vikings were.
They're represented in a lot of ways, from TV shows to historical reenactments, and the odd historical misconception from the Victorians about Vikings wearing horn helmets. Vikings are a popular topic, from the culture, fashion, history, ruins, ships, etc. But if you were living in Britain from the 9th to the 11th century, the Vikings would be rather annoying to deal with, alongside all the other problems of living in the Middle Ages. The Vikings were known for raiding and slaughtering all across Britain, plus they even conquered and settled in places in Britain, which begs the question, out of all the peoples living in Britain during the Viking Age, who resisted them the best?
Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go and raid that abbey for the glory of Odin.
Before I answer this question, I need to give some background context. Britain in the 9th and 11th century had many kingdoms within it that make up the kingdoms we know today, such as England, Scotland, and Wales. But in this period of the Middle Ages, these kingdoms were in different shapes and forms. For example, Wales had many different kingdoms and sub-kingdoms that make up the location we know today. The same with England and Scotland to a degree. I'll explain more of the background as we explore each kingdom and how the Vikings affected them, with an introduction from each country and a chronicler from that said country, such as the Anglo-Saxon chronicles for England or the Welsh annals for Wales. And at the end, I'll compare all the kingdoms and decide who resisted the Vikings the best. Let's start alphabetically with England. So England historically is a combination of many Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and Cornwall, such as the kingdoms of Kent, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Northumbria, etc., plus the Viking settled lands called the Danelaw. But as for the first recorded mention of the Vikings in the chronicles for what would become England, we have this from the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. And in his days there came for the first time 3 ships, and then the reeve rode there and wanted to compel them to go to the king's town, because he did not know what they were, and they killed him. Those were the first ships of the Danish men which sought out the land of the English race. The reeve asked a question and got an axe in the face. Not the greatest start of a trading relationship. The Vikings that would come to England normally would not just take the riches from monasteries and churches as they were pagan, but also people. Able-bodied people would fetch a nice price on the many slave markets across Europe. Now, the most famous raid conducted by the Vikings on England is again the first recorded raid, which was on the holy island of Lindisfarne, although there may have been earlier ones, just not recorded. This is the early Middle Ages in Britain after all. Once again, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. Here, terrible portents came about in the land of Northumbria, and miserably afflicted the people. These were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air, and there immediately followed a great famine. And a little after that, in the same year on 8th of January, the raiding of heathen men miserably devastated God's church in Lindisfarne Island by looting and slaughter. The English kingdom of Northumbria is the first recorded nation to suffer from a Viking attack. Northumbria is located here on this map. Typically, the famous raid of Lindisfarne is used as the starting point for the Viking Age in 793, and other chroniclers would record this Viking attack, such as the Annals of Ulster, devastation of all the islands of Britain by heathens. Based off the chronicles, many different ones give the Vikings differing names. For example, as I just quoted, heathens, but also Norse, Danes, Gentiles, etc. So to try and not to be repetitive throughout this video, I will use these names every so often. If this video does well enough, I'll make another video comparing France and Ireland in who resisted the Vikings the best out of those two nations. Moving on, the next time the Norse pop up is again in Northumbria, in which in 796, the heathens raided in Northumbria and looted Egfrith's minster at the Don mouth, and there one of their commanders was killed, and also some of their ships were broken up by bad weather, and many of them drowned there, and some came to shore alive, and then were immediately killed at the river mouth. So while the second time the Northumbrians resisted and defeated a Viking raid, the attack on Lindisfarne was huge news in Europe. The fact that one of the holiest sites in Britain was targeted by the heathens and God chose not to protect the monastery. Clearly, it was a sign that either God was displeased or that the people were sinners. That's normally what medieval chroniclers' conclusions were when these things happened. Here's an example, an extract from a letter to the archbishops in Canterbury and York from Charlemagne. The pagans have contaminated God's shrines and spilt the blood of saints in the passage around the altar. They have laid waste the house of our consolation, and in the temple of God they have trampled underfoot the bodies of the saints like shit in the street. Charlemagne not mincing words there. However, after the Northumbrians' victory over the Norsemen in 796, the accounts recorded in England don't mention any major raids by the Vikings until 836 AD. However, raids most likely happened as there were provisions in place for certain religious estates, where charters issued by the kings granted lands to these places where they could seek refuge if an attack occurred. However, if one was to read the Annals of Ulster from 796 to 836, it seems the Vikings were there, as the source just repeats, location raided by the heathens, heathens burned and looted this, here and here, etc. One crucial element in how the Vikings managed to get around Britain is 1. Their longboats, which came in many different sizes and designs, such as warships or cargo ships. A few examples of later designs can be seen on the Bayeux Tapestry, a contemporary source from the 11th century. Then there's some ruin stones which depict them. But we're lucky that there exists a pretty intact Norse ship dated from the 9th century, the Gokstad ship. The ships of the Vikings are strongly tied to the pop culture image most people have of them, I would argue. The design of many longships were different depending on the type of ship, i.e., a raiding ship would be sleeker in order to traverse the different waterways, such as bending rivers or shallow pools, and powered by rowing oars, whereas trade ships would have deeper hulls in order to carry more trade goods and supplies, which would use sails over oars, and the best ships would be owned by the kings in Scandinavia. One ship from the Olaf saga, named the Long Serpent, quote, "The winter after that, King Olaf was come from Halagoland, caused he to be built under the cliffs at Ladia, a great ship, a ship far mightier than any other ship of that land, and the stocks whereon she was built are still to be seen. Of this ship was Thorberg the master smith, but with him were many others at work, some felling trees, some shaping them, some hammering nails, and some carrying timber. All the material was of the choicest, and the ship was both long and broad, built with great beams, and the bulwarks thereof were high." While that account is from the 13th century, it gives us a small look into how these ships might have been built, as Scandinavia has a lot of forests, as that's where many of the death metal bands emerge from. There's also the large amount of oak and pine trees, which make ideal planks for traversing the dangerous seas. The designs of these ships would be used by others through trade, and where the Vikings settled and colonized across Europe. However, certain aspects of the longship have come from others in previous centuries before the Viking Age, as trade is a vital factor in how ideas and designs are exchanged between cultures. One example is the design of the sails. Of course, it's not just the design of the ships, but who's sailing. the skill of the crew and navigator, plus the weather and the condition of the seas, all determine where the Vikings might go. So I've given some information on how the Norse got around Britain in their ships. But one other major difference for how each nation suffered from Viking attacks is geography. England compared to Scotland and Wales is much easier to traverse around. While it has many hills in the north like the Pennines and the forests, such as the Forest of Dean or the New Forest, it doesn't really have many mountainous places to traverse, again compared to Scotland and Wales. And that was a major part in how the Vikings attacked places in England, the terrain and the geography, with coastal attacks being incredibly commonplace. Also using the many rivers that ran throughout England, such as the Avon, the Trent, the Thames, etc. And remember, this is the early Middle Ages. A lot of this landmass hasn't been drained like it would be over the centuries. Islands exist, such as the island of Thanet along here in Kent, but also the marshes of Somerset around here. And the Norse would use these islands as bases to sometimes stay over winter and launch further attacks on Britain. So now that I've given some context on how the Norse were able to get around and attack places in England, let's resume the timeline of Viking activity. As I said, the next major attack mentioned by a chronicler is in 835. Here, heathen men raided around Sheppey, which is just, again, another small island just off the coast of Kent. However, this is just the beginning for the kingdoms of England. I'm not going to quote every single raid mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, otherwise we would be here all day. Just the major ones, the first one being in 836, quote, "Here King Egbert fought against 35 shiploads at Carhampton, and great slaughter was made there, and the Danish had possession of the place of slaughter." The Anglo-Saxon chronicles uses the phrase great slaughter and places of slaughter quite a lot when it comes to the Vikings, which means that while they suffered potentially significant casualties, they were not dislodged from where they had set up, as this army was large enough that it may have been an invading force or a settling force for 35 ships. If they're the same size of ships such as the Gokstad ship, then they could carry quite a number of people and supplies. One of the major reasons for the success of the Vikings, especially later in the 9th and 10th century, is that they appeared at the right time and place, as the kingdoms in Britain had a terrible habit of fighting each other. Even in 825, where the two biggest kingdoms that make up England, Mercia and Wessex, had a climactic battle against each other at the Battle of Elladoun in 825. There was also a lot of infighting, as I would explain with Northumbria in a moment. But the fighting against the Norse would continue with mixed results, as in 840, Alderman Wulfherd fought at Southampton against 33 shiploads and made great slaughter there and took the victory. Then in the same year, Alderman Ethelhelm fought against a Danish raiding army on Portland with the Dorset men, and for a good while they put the raiding army to flight, and the Danish had possession of the place of slaughter and killed the alderman. More raids and attacks would continue until towards the end of the 840s, where a large number of Norse forces would turn their gaze and sails back towards the Kingdom of Francia, looting and raiding there as they had done in the 830s. However, in 850, the chronicles record that for the first time, the heathen men stayed over the winter, protected by the natural elements and marshy terrain of the Isle of Thanet. This was a sign of things to come. To which we can read from the life of King Alfred, written by everyone's favourite Welsh monk, Asa, in which he states that in 851, in the same year, a great Viking army with 350 ships came into the mouth of the River Thames and ravaged Canterbury, the city of the men of Kent, and London, situated on the northern banks of the River Thames, on the boundary of Essex and Middlesex. Though the city properly belongs to Essex, they put to the flight Brynwulf, king of the Mercians, who, with all his army, had come to do battle against them. So the second most powerful English kingdom failed to defeat this Norse army. However, the King of Wessex, Aethelwulf, and his son commanded an army that defeated the Vikings near a place called Oakfield, the greatest slaughter of the heathens. So if we just pause here for a moment and review how the English kingdoms are doing against the Norse, it's a bit of a mixture. Some big victories, but also some big failures, especially with London and Canterbury being raided, both of which are fortified places. The defeat of the Mercian army, as well as Wessex defeat at Carhampton, the kingdom of East Anglia being raided. Yet, as I mentioned, Wessex defeated the Viking army that attacked London and Canterbury. Interestingly, Northumbria hasn't been mentioned since their victory over the Norse in 796, so it's clear that kingdom will be fine. Clearly the Norse, after their defeat, spread the news not to mess with the Northumbrians. Now allow me to introduce the next wave of Vikings with appropriate music. Plus, we have names for both the army and some of their leaders.
The Great Heathen Army and their tour of England!
The Great Heathen Army was a collection of Norse bands of raiders into one big army. The exact size of the army is unknown. We can only speculate how many troops this army could field, yet the size must have been significant, as according to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, stating that in 866, a great heathen raiding army came to the land of the English and took winter quarters from the East Anglians, and were provided with horses there, and they made peace with them. Asser as well calls them a great Viking fleet, and mentions the next years as such terrible wars, and in year-by-year reckoning. Because this army was a mixture of raiding bands, the location of where they came from is a variety of places. Some might have been from the Norse force that spent the winter of 865 on Thanet. Others came from Francia, as that kingdom had improved its defensive capabilities across the Seine River. So rather than trying to take on a larger and somewhat unified country, the Norse came to Britain looking for the smaller kingdoms to take advantage of. This Viking force being led by Guthrum, Ivar, Halfdan, Ubba. However, trying to track all of these leaders is quite difficult, especially with the limited sources that we have, so rather than referring to all of these leaders as in a same capacity, what I'll do is I'll just refer to the Great Heathen Army as it moves across England. Now the Viking army was supplied with horses, they moved much quicker throughout England, and before long this vast horde went towards Northumbria. Remember I mentioned about how sometimes the Vikings picked the right time and place to strike? Well, given that the Vikings had spent the winter in East Anglia, there's every indication that they had gathered or heard news of what was happening in Northumbria, the chronicles explain. Here the raiding army went from East Anglia over the mouth of the Humber to York City in Northumbria, and there was great discord of the nation among themselves, and they had thrown down their king Osbert and accepted Elia, an unnatural king, and it was late in the year when they turned to making war against the raiding army. Nevertheless, they gathered a great army and sought out the raiding army at York City and broke into the city, and some of them got inside, and an immense slaughter was made of the Northumbrians there, some inside, some outside, and both kings were killed, and the survivors made peace with the raiding army. So the Northumbrians put up a good fight and went down fighting. Although not the end of the kingdom of Northumbria, it was dealt a blow to which it would never recover. The city of York at this time was a fortified city, meaning that attacking a walled settlement was a dangerous tactic, which, if we go with that account of the battle from the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, then the Northumbrians' attack backfired. Whether this was due to a planned ruse by the Norse to trap them, or just the attack faltered, The end result was the kings were dead, and most of the Northumbrian army was destroyed. The next target for the great heathen army was Mercia, to which the Mercian king Burgred played the card, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," and sent a request to Wessex to join forces. As I said, Mercia and Wessex had clashed back in 825, but now with this seemingly invincible and treacherous adversary, there was a need for both Christian kingdoms to unite. The following encounter with the great heathen army ended in a stalemate, with the Mercians making peace with them. Now the next action for the great heathen army is one that created a figure that became a symbol of English national identity. 869. Here the raiding army rode across Mercia into East Anglia and took winter quarters at Thetford, and that winter King Edmund fought against them, and the Danish took victory and killed the king, and conquered all that land. So that's the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of East Anglia wiped out and conquered by the Norse, becoming part of what would later be known as the Danelaw, an area of land occupied and settled by the Norse. Yet Edmund's death would make him a later patron saint of England, as later tales would say he was tied to a tree and had many arrows loosed into him. Regardless of how he died, the Vikings had unwittingly created a tale that became a major part of English history. Now we come to two of the major leaders against the Vikings for England, Aethelred I of Wessex and his younger brother, Alfred. These two would lead and fight against the great heathen army in many battles over the next few years, with victories and defeats for both the men of Wessex and the Norse. Then, according to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, in 870, after this fight, a great summer fleet arrived. There would be even worse news for Wessex. After Easter, King Aethelred died. Alfred was now on his own. All his many brothers were dead, and the Vikings were now not only more powerful thanks to the summer fleet, but were also entrenched and settling around their newly conquered lands. Yet in King Alfred, the Vikings would meet a formidable and stubborn foe. As in 1 year, there were reported 9 national fights against the great heathen army, killing 9 jarls and 1 king, before making peace for a time by 871, with vast amounts of silver coins and gold goods. Alfred had brought some time to prepare for a return of the Norse army, as the Norse army headed to London to set up winter quarters there. So while Wessex was rebuilding and trying to fortify itself, the same can't be said for Mercia, as by 874 the great heathen army had invaded deep into the heart of Mercia, with the chronicles stating that they had reached as far as Repton, and from there they had forced the Mercian king, King Burgred, to leave his kingdom for Rome, where he later died. As for the kingdom itself, the chronicles explain, they granted the kingdom of Mercia to be held by a foolish king's thane, and he swore them oaths and granted hostages, that it should be ready for them whichever day they might want it, and he himself should be ready with all who would follow him at the service of the raiding army. So let's pause again. The kingdom of Mercia, at one point one of the most powerful English kingdoms in Britain, was now reduced to a vassal state. Now the only English kingdom left intact was the kingdom of Wessex. Northumbria had tried to re-establish itself in 872, but that was soon put down by the Norse army. England being united at this point seemed such a far-thought idea. Yet there would be some good news for Wessex, as in 875 the great heathen army had split in two, or had split into smaller groups. Halfdan took some of the army back to Northumbria, where he would divide up the land and begin to settle and farm in 876, while Guthrum would take his band of troops and headed towards Cambridge. Alfred, meanwhile, in 875, was fighting off a Viking fleet. King Alfred fought a naval battle at sea against 6 Viking ships. He captured one of them, and the others escaped by flight. The next 3 years would see a series of fights between Wessex and the heathen army under Guthrum. with Alfred being caught off guard and forced to seek refuge in the marshes of Somerset. Wessex, it seems, was on the cusp of falling and sharing the same fate as all the other English kingdoms by 878. Yet two things happened that changed Wessex fortunes. In Devon, in a place called Countisbury, the Vikings had closed in on an Iron Age hill fort, where a number of Wessex men were held up. Asser describes the fight. Instead, they began to besiege it, thinking that those men would soon give way, forced by hunger, thirst, and the siege, since there is no water near the stronghold. But it did not turn out as they thought. For the Christians, long before they were liable to suffer want in any way, were divinely inspired and judging it much better to gain either death or victory, burst out unexpectedly at dawn against the Vikings, and by virtue of their aggressiveness, from the very outset, they overwhelmed the enemy in large part, together with their king, a few escaping by flight to the ships.
While we don't know the exact number of men slain, the victory may have given Alfred the respite he needed to emerge and start to take back Wessex, which he started by making a fortress, and he soon gathered the men of Hampshire, Somerset and Wiltshire before confronting the Vikings at Edington. This battle is one of the most famous out of the many clashes between Wessex and the Vikings. Yet we don't have the fullest details on the fighting. The best account we have comes from Asser's account, in which he writes, "Fighting fiercely with a compact shield wall against the entire Viking army, he persevered resolutely for a long time. At length he gained the victory through God's will. He destroyed the Vikings with great slaughter and pursued those who fled as far as the stronghold, hacking them down."
So while Asser's account is obviously pro-Wessex, we can at least learn that the battle lasted a long time and the style of the fighting. What happened next is something that hadn't happened in Britain before, in terms of dealing with the Vikings. Alfred knew he would never be able to displace the Norse out of Britain. They were settling into their conquered lands, yet Alfred was known for his long-term planning. If the Norse were here to stay, then being on the same page would help ease and build relations. Alfred did this by having Guthrum and some of the other leaders baptized, the results of which soon displayed themselves as another Norse fleet arrived and sailed up the Thames, spending the winter. Yet, whether tired of fighting or sticking to his oath, Guthrum, now baptized as Aethelred, chose to settle into the lands of East Anglia. This new fleet then departed to Francia. Other than making contact with Guthrum, we don't know much else about this fleet. But after 878, Alfred's Wessex went from strength to strength, building more burhs, aka fortified settlements, across Wessex, some made using existing fortifications or Iron Age forts. Some were built to guard vital trade routes. Burhs had existed prior to Alfred, but he ordered many others to be built during his reign. The Wessex navy was greatly expanded, demonstrated by the many accounts of naval fights with Wessex in the chronicles.
The arrival of the great heathen army nearly crushed all of the English kingdoms apart from Wessex, as Wessex is the only one that really survived intact, hence why most of nearly all the contemporary sources are so pro-Wessex. Despite all of this, the Vikings would remain a threat. But in the next century, during the reign of Alfred's successor, Edward the Elder, plus his daughter, Aethelred, Lady of the Mercians, these two forces would combine, with Wessex being controlled by Edward the Elder and Mercia being controlled by Aethelred. They not only went from containing the Vikings, but then also conquering them. Combine that with the rapid integration of Christianity within the new Norse community, because I'm sure with the Norse going Christian, that will solve all of the problems. Right? Right?
The idea of England becomes reality by 927 under Edward the Elder's successor, Aethelstan, who forms England. While there were fights and raids during Edward's and Aethelstan's reign, they were not as widespread. and compared to Alfred's reign, not so many back and forth victories and defeats. Plus the chronicles for both Edward's and Ethelstan's reign aren't as detailed as Alfred's. They also didn't have their own biographer as Alfred did in Asser's account. As the 10th century progressed, the Viking attacks and raids simmered down to such a low level that during the reign of King Edgar, there are no recorded attacks. But during the reign of his young son, Aethelred, the attacks by the Norse resumed to a level of destruction close to, and in some cases, exceeding the great heathen army. Quote, Southampton was ravaged by a raiding ship army, and most of the town dwellers killed or taken prisoner. And the same year, the land of Thanet was raided, and the same year, Cheshire was raided by a northern raiding ship army. The period of peace before the return of recorded attacks by the Norse could have been interpreted at the time as a sign that God was displeased and that a great many sins had been committed, and as a punishment, the return of these attacks. During the reign of King Edgar, gleaming over the sources, it seems his rule was more preoccupied with the spiritual side of his kingdom rather than its defense. The same thing occurs during Aethelred's reign. Aethelred was a bad king, and these new assaults by the Norse were led by formidable kings, such as Olaf Tryggvason and Sven Forkbeard. These two kings would raid across England during the 990s. The major problem for England was that Aethelred never really led any substantial armies to combat the Norse raiding armies. On one occasion, a great host was gathered in London, and instead of leading it himself, like all his predecessors would have done, instead, he gave the command to an ealdorman. Aethelred's bad decision-making would eventually cost him the throne after the St. Brice's Day massacre in November 1002, in which many prominent Danes were killed, or the Norse mercenaries that were within the Danelaw were also killed. There's different interpretations of this event, so be sure to check the references in the top comment and description tab. Aethelred tried to protect England, ordering a new fleet to be built in 1008 and defences shored up. But it wasn't enough. A new Norse army arrived in 1013 in Sandwich, Kent, led by Sven Forkbeard. Many of the ealdormen submitted to Sven with hostages, while Aethelred stayed in London, and before long Aethelred had sent his family to Normandy, before he himself fled there in exile. England was conquered by the Norse for about 2 weeks. As in one tale, Saint Edmund, the martyred king killed by the Vikings, came down from heaven and killed Sven with a holy lance. England was saved for about 2 weeks. Edmund clearly forgot about Sven's ambitious and young son, Canute, as the invasion of England in 1016 by Canute was on par or exceeded the destruction caused by the great heathen army. And this was a Christian Viking force. The fighting between Canute and the new king of England, Edmund, as Aethelred finally died, was fierce. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles mentions many battles between the two sides, with each side gaining victory in one battle and losing the next one, until one final battle at Sandon, in which Canute won. The two adversaries would meet in Deerhurst in Gloucestershire and split England into 2 parts, with Canute and Edmund ruling each part. I've always felt that Canute agreed to this because Edmund was grievously wounded in battle, as by November 1016, Edmund was dead, and Canute succeeded to the kingdom, so that is England once again conquered by the Vikings. England resisted the Vikings well, but in the end they were conquered twice, putting England in the C category for conquered. The next kingdom on our list is Alba/Scotland. Now, I do have a historical map of Scotland, I just haven't unfolded it yet because my hands are rather full. So make sure you're subscribed, like the video, hype the video, share it, and if you want to see more content, you can become a Patreon member or a YouTube channel member, which will give you access to bonus videos and behind the scenes content. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you for Viking Scotland.